Welcome, and we'll go through these relatively quickly and leave a lot of time for questions, which is really the important part of this. So just wanted to open up with a view of the Connecticut greenhouse gas emissions inventory. You'll notice the date says 2017. We track about 3 years behind actual emissions in performing this report. I think everybody on the call and at the meeting recognizes that climate change is an important policy for the state of Connecticut. We were one of the first states to adopt mandatory carbon reduction targets through our Global Warming Solutions Act. We have a renewable energy portfolio standard, which mandates increasing percentages of our electricity coming from clean, renewable energy resources. And we are one of the founding participants of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which caps carbon emissions from the electricity sector, and also generates a fair amount of revenue for our clean energy and energy efficiency programs. So you can see where we are here. Our first target under the Global Warming Solutions Act is to reduce our emissions by 10% below 1990 levels. And if you look at the little just note in the blue box at the bottom of the chart, you'll see that where we were 3 years ago has us meeting that target, although challenges remain. If you look at the circle on the right, you'll see some of the things that we need to deal with. Transportation is probably the biggest problem that we need to solve, not only because it's the biggest portion of our emissions profile, which it is, but also it's a lot of diffuse individualized sources as opposed to electricity, where it's a few large power plants, although that is changing. This next slide presents that same data, but maybe in a little bit more easily viewed form. The blue line at the top is the state's overall emissions. The other lines, you can see the legend at the bottom, represent various sectors: transportation, which we were talking about, that orange line, and the combined residential, commercial, and industrial building sector, sort of tracking right along with that. Speaking of our challenges, you'll see we have our 10% mark here for 2020, and previous to that, our emissions have sort of been floating in this brief band here, this 10 million metric tons of carbon equivalent band. Beginning this year, you can see we really need to increase our efforts. We need to be on a very steep decline to meet first our 45% target in 2030. And then looking out to 2050, we have an aggressive 80% carbon emissions reduction target. This red arrow that you see sort of incongruously placed by the 2040 bar represents Governor Lamont's stated policy goal and directive of reducing our electricity sector emissions to zero by 2040, and electricity is that gray line. So you can see if we meet that target, we can take that off the table and focus on transportation and buildings. So the question becomes, how are we going to get where we need to go, considering the significant reductions and challenges that we have? So there is currently a lot of work happening in different venues to address our greenhouse gas and clean energy goals. But I just wanted to start with a snapshot of some of the unfinished business from the last regular session of the General Assembly. And we're not going to get into detail about all of these, but this is a list of bills which touch on various climate policies that were raised before the legislature last session, our 2020 session, which all had public hearings. But if you look at the dates there, it was the end of February, the beginning of March, and mid-March, we had to shut the legislative process down. So these things are all sort of hanging out there. And just touching on them briefly, they include increasing the energy performance of our buildings through increased transparency, building labeling for energy use, and advancing building codes, decreasing the barriers and increasing access to charging stations for electric vehicles, and enhancing the effectiveness of the state's clean distributed energy resources through the expansion of energy storage systems in the state, as well as incorporating our climate mitigation goals into all of our regulatory decision making, a very broad sort of cross-cutting goal there in the wake of some adverse decisions on our climate goals, such as the permitting of the Killingly natural gas plant, which you may have read about in the news. So as we move towards the January start of the next session, these policies and many more are likely to be incorporated into the final report of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and we'll be talking about them a little bit later in that process. So we just talked a little bit about the legislature. That's just one actor, one body that has a significant role to play in our climate policy though. Our state agencies, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, as well as DAS, the Department of Administrative Services, which deals with our state procurements, the Department of Transportation, they all also play critical roles. And while the legislative session stalled, agency work really has continued throughout the pandemic without pause. They really pivoted and adapted to doing their work virtually very easily, obviously with far more facility than I have managed this afternoon. And just touching on some of these high profile policies which we've been engaging in. So we name check the Governor's Council on Climate Change. DEEP is working to finalize its integrated resources plan, which will be looking at a suite of policies, significantly laying out the pathways to meet Governor Lamont's goal of 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040, but also looking at opportunities to reform the regional wholesale electricity market in a way that actually supports rather than hinders the growth and development of renewable energy resources. And that's something that we have been working with, or DEEP has been working on with ISO New England. We have some great offshore wind targets, and as part of that, we've established a Council on Environmental Standards to ensure that all of our offshore wind procurements meet the highest environmental standards and take into consideration impacts on local industries such as commercial fisheries. The Connecticut EV roadmap was revised by DEEP with input from us and other stakeholders to sort of lay out a vision of how to achieve our wide-scale electrification of the transportation sector, one policy that's going to be critical to reach our climate goals. And there are a few incentive programs through both the VW settlement as well as the state's own cheaper program to help individuals purchase electric vehicles. And on the PURA side, Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, there are a number of dockets that have been open to look at how to modernize our electricity grid in a way that supports and encourages the development of renewable energy resources, while also ensuring that our energy remains affordable for our residents. So they're looking at advanced metering infrastructure, how we can enable two-way communications between the electricity you're using in your home and the needs of the grid as a whole, increasing battery storage, zero-emission vehicles, as well as the value of DER, looking at ways, or the legislature directed them to revise the way that we provide incentives to rooftop solar. So that's happening through that docket, as well as the shared solar program that Kurt mentioned. And I think we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. And of course, Shared clean energy facilities, SCEF, it's really just shared solar. These are some timeline benchmarks. I think the takeaway here is that we are on track to have the program up and running by the summer of next year. There have been a couple of speed bumps along the way. Most recently, the utilities plan to identify and enroll low and moderate income customers per statutory directive, met with some criticism from PURA. We've been talking with the utilities ourselves, as other stakeholders have been, looking for ways to improve that process. The Connecticut program actually provides a bid preference for projects on landfills or brownfields, and there's that picture on the right you can see. I know there's been some concerns about siting of large utility scale solar in Connecticut because of its potential impact on greenfields, farmland. So this is really just to illustrate that there are opportunities to site these projects on land which is not otherwise extremely valuable, which may otherwise deter investment and development because of issues around contamination or other things. And one of the customer enrollment pieces that we're also encouraging the utilities to adopt is to really provide a preference for customers near these sorts of located sites, so that communities that have had to deal with decades of living with the burdens of these polluted properties now will also realize the benefit of clean renewable energy that can be sited there.
I think we'll call this about the 2-minute warning.
Okay, and it may take me 2 minutes to advance the slide. There we go. From solar to offshore wind, this is just a list of some of the state targets that have recently been adopted, including Connecticut's 2,000 megawatt solicitation. New York just recently increased its offshore wind energy target to 9,000 megawatts by 2035. And there are a number of projects in various stages, Revolution Wind and Vineyard Wind here in Connecticut, which will use New London and Bridgeport as staging areas, increasing economic development opportunities in those cities and the surrounding communities. Several projects in New York that you can see sort of in the lower middle portion of your screen there. And this photo is North America's first offshore wind farm, which is very close to us, just off of Block Island, a 5 turbine installation, which is providing power primarily for Block Island, although it is also connected to the mainland, but allows for the first time Block Island to not be dependent on shipments of oil to power their communities. So I think that's great. And I mentioned we have Commission on Environmental Standards here. Save the Sound is also working with New England for Offshore Wind as a steering committee member and the Connecticut lead. That's a group of advocacy organizations representing all 6 New England states to promote a coordinated approach as we develop these resources, as well as working with WindWorks Long Island, which is really focused on the Long Island region of New York wind procurements. I thought this would be a helpful slide just because we talk about procurements in Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts, and you wonder, well, where are these actually being built? Are these going in Long Island Sound? They're not going in Long Island Sound. These colored blocks represent all of the federal lease areas that are currently have active proposals or have been sort of reserved by particular offshore wind companies. So the multicolored block on the top of the screen is really where most of our projects are. The Bridgeport project is the bottom half of the orange rectangle, and the New London project is the top portion of that sort of turquoise. And those are all in federal waters, although there are interconnects in this case to Cape Cod for that energy. And then lastly, the Governor's Council on Climate Change. I think the important thing to note here is that it has a much expanded focus. It's looking at adaptation and resiliency, as well as equity and environmental justice, rather than just straight carbon reduction policies. So a broad integrated approach. And there is a public comment period that's now open. It's going to run until October 21st. So you still have a couple of weeks. And there are some links to the draft reports of all of the working groups and the teams, as well as the email that you can send comments to. But a quick Google of Governor's Council on Climate Change will also get you where you need to go, hopefully. So, and that, after several missteps, is it, and happy to dive into more detail on any of those or other issues that folks are interested in.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you everyone for bearing with our technical technical issues. In a perfect world, working remotely would also come with reliable internet, but I think we all know that unfortunately it doesn't always. So yeah, so we have, I think, about 9 minutes left at this point before we return to the main room, so we can open it up for questions. If folks want to go ahead and put those in the chat, that would be great. I think while folks are doing that, let me just kick it off with one thing following up on the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which is, Charles, I wonder if you could talk with folks a little bit about what Save the Sound's involvement specifically in the GC3 is, and who participates in it in general, who makes up the council.
Sure. Save the Sound is a member of the GC3 itself, which is 23 individuals. They represent agencies such as DEEP and the Department of Health. They represent businesses. Stanley Black & Decker is a member of the GC3. Municipalities have representatives there, as well as obviously nonprofits. So, 23, it's not a lot of folks, but there's broad representation among sort of sectors. My role specifically, Kurt sits on the GC3. I'm a co-chair of the mitigation working group, and specifically heading up the cross-sector and non-energy teams, looking at policies related to emissions reductions economy-wide, as well as things like refrigerants and our waste operations. So you can sort of see here all of the various working groups, as well as the individual teams, which are bulleted, and the specific focuses that they're working on. And you can see on the mitigation working group, so the report, our draft report, is about 120 pages. It covers electricity, transportation, buildings, some of the policies we touched on as unfinished business from the legislature, but some new policies as well. In terms of the cross-sector piece, one of the high priority items is really establishing the requirement that agencies consider the impact on our climate goals when making their regulatory decisions. I don't think anyone is thinking that will necessarily bind them, but it may give them pause, and I think it's an important check on the actions that we're taking to realize that if we choose this particular option at this point in time, here are all the other things that we're going to have to do in order to offset that. So it's not just a freebie. If we build a Killingly power plant, maybe we need it. I think the consensus is clear that we don't, but what else then will we have to do to ensure that we maintain our targets? So that's sort of analysis.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, and we have a few questions in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Some of them have gone to everyone, and some have come just to me. So Charles has not seen them yet. So let me just kind of go through here. Let's start out with, obviously with wind power, there are sometimes concerns about impacts on birds and other wildlife. Could you talk a little bit more about the body that's involved with, with Connecticut's wind selection process and making sure that the projects selected were as environmentally responsible as possible?
Yes. So Audubon is very involved. They are a member of the Council on Environmental Standards. They're also a very active member in Connecticut of sort of an informal group of environmental nonprofits having regular communication with DEEP and Vineyard Wind as they refine and develop that project. And there is a big focus on improving the science around environmental best practices as it relates not only to birds, but marine mammals and fisheries, as well as habitat. Clearly we want these projects to be as environmentally responsible as possible. But I think it's also really important to keep in mind, I think nothing is going to get necessarily the incidence of bird strike down to zero. And you know what? Fossil fuel power plants kill birds as well. I don't mean that flippantly, just as a fact. I think sometimes folks don't recognize that there's mortality from other sources of power as well. So it is a balancing act, but that's all to say that there are folks whose main mission is avians who are very deeply involved in the processes and supportive of our efforts to transition to clean power, including wind power. A great question about transportation emissions by type. I don't have that breakdown at my fingertips. My sense is the majority of it is really we're talking about light duty passenger vehicles. So your motor vehicle. Although clearly medium and heavy duty vehicles play a role as well, and happy maybe to follow up with some of those numbers. I just don't recall off the top of my head. I should note, given the focus of that question though, that Connecticut has just signed a multi-state memorandum of understanding to reduce emissions from our medium and heavy duty vehicle fleet. So rest assured that is not a sector of our transportation fleet that is being ignored, and working in concert with other Northeast states looking to take action to address that, despite not getting very much help from the federal government at this point.
Thank you. All right, so it looks like we've got 2 more minutes before we get kicked back into the main room. Another question from Mary, which is whether the current press for utility form after this summer's outages and storms, whether that provides opportunities for pro-climate initiatives or not.
It does. I mean, so clearly the focus of the efforts were not directly climate related, although I think everyone on joining the meeting today is sophisticated enough to realize that we're having these issues because of the changes that we're experiencing as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. One thing which kind of was not highlighted, but if you read the bill closely, is there for the performance-based regulation of utilities. One of the elements that they will be judged on is compliance with our Global Warming Solutions Act. So I think that opens up the opportunity to bring our climate goals and our how well we're doing in meeting them into a number of regulatory discussions and regulatory proceedings, which maybe they would not have been necessarily appropriate before because of a narrow statutory charge. So it's something that's easy to overlook, but from a climate perspective, probably one of the biggest pieces of that bill.